This is an IC on my mistakes, my teachers. So we've already been informed that we have been a little late to start. So without much delay, I would like to start my presentation. I'll be the first one to start. And we'll try to stick to as brief as possible. And just give me a minute for this to start. And unexpected patient. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Unexpected post-op LASIK complication. The lesson learned is my topic. These are my financial interests. When you look at LASIK complications, in today's context, we're looking at glare, halos, blurring of vision, asthenopic symptoms. I would like to divide my talk from optics, pathological alteration post-surgery, ocular motility, the personality, and all that goes into making a patient unhappy, which includes all of them. The approach to unhappy patient is a very detailed examination, which I don't want to dwell into, but it's all about from your tears to brain, try to look at everything possible which can make him unhappy. The visual assessment, the dry eye assessment, but it's important when you look at dry eye to look at the tear film very closely. There are different types of tear film assessment today, which looks at an optical scatter index. But if you don't have it, if you are having a good tear film quality on your Shermer's or T-Bud, that itself would be a very good way to assess the quality of the tear film. But if you have access to it, today there are a lot of new technologies where based on the tear film itself, it will tell you the depth of focus, the vision changes as it increases with your T-Bud parameters. A good T-Bud, a good vision keeps your tear film perfect. When your T-Bud is fluctuating, you can see that there's a lot of variation out there. This is a classic example of what I just showed, a perfect one, an imperfect tear film. And the scatter is related to these kind of tear film, which increases your glare. So glare just shows, this slide just shows the glare can just come directly from your tear film itself. This is not part of the seminar today, but dry eye treatment is very important. You can look at the medical line or you can look at the surgical line of treatment. When you look at the pathological alterations of it, it's most important to rule out topography, ocular aberrations, to rule out a decentration or central small zone or undercorrection or overcorrection. This is an example of a good centration and a completely decentered ablation. And you can see the quality of vision here. We introduced this concept of field nomogram to evaluate decentration. Decentration is when, when it's decentered by more than 5.5 millimeter. That would induce a large amount of scatter and halos out there. And how decentration evaluation and applying laser. This part is evaluation. This part is all about correction. So how do you do the workup? When you do the workup, the most important thing is ask if there is a symptom. If you have a decentration and you have a symptom, you do see glare, halos, night vision, or you don't have it. There are at least 30 to 40% of them, the brain neuroadapts. You don't need to do anything with them because they're happy with glasses and contact lenses. If yes, if you put a contact lenses, it's a rigid lenses because it reduces the aberration. And most of the time, the cornea is the culprit. You know that why the patient is unhappy. The problem is in the cornea. When there's no improvement, and then for them, you consider laser. When there is no improvement, look out. If the cornea is not your problem, look out for your lenses, your higher order internal aberrations, and think about a lens-based ablation if it's a lens is a culprit. And the DLI and other things which I'm going to discuss is going to be part of it. Still, this is normal. The lenses are normal, internal aberration are normal. Then look at non-strabismic binocular single vision SUSUs, which needs to be treated accordingly. And in lens-based procedures, if your cornea is irregular, you can actually treat the cornea first and then do the cataract surgery. This is the protocol, what we follow for decentration or glare or halos at night. This is I already explained about the role of contact lenses. Lens status is very important, and your DLI or PNS reading on the Pentacam is very useful. And you can even use if you don't have the eye trace, you can use the internal aberration from the OPD3 scanners. The ocular motility is one of the most important factors in today's world, especially when you are under lockdown, and 99% of them are doing some kind of work, excessive work with the visual monitors. The most important thing is your ocular motility. And we have again come out with some guidelines on this. It's called the Rome guidelines, the refractive surgery ocular motility impact nexus. What it means is it looks at how the ocular motility have an impact on your being unhappy or happy post-surgery. Non-strabismic binocular single vision is one of the most common masquerade, which you need to always look for. So when a patient comes to you, before you move to anything else, make sure that you pick up somebody in your team who can do a very good orthoptics evaluation. Look for accommodative issues, look for vergence issues. It is very important that once you rule out these two issues, look at office-based or home-based exercises. These are flippers, these are office-based exercises, symbol cards, block strings. This helps to bring in a lot more strength to their ocular motility. So when you look at the glare, which is again one of the most important factors, you look at, again, I mentioned in the beginning, it's more like a recap here. Look at the epithelial mapping out here, assess the myopial strength, and see if it's a true regression. This is more for regression when the patient is come to you saying that he's got a power back, and this again always a cause of concern. If it's true, do a retreatment. But if it's normal, and then you see a lot of changes in the densitometry can happen anytime after the age of 40, then you probably need to take care of a cataract surgery out here. But what is most important is pseudo-regression. This is a patient who may have even up to a -3 or 4 diopters of regression. 99% of my practice, this is the problem here, is most of the time, the pseudo-regression here is always looked at it as a true regression, and sometimes it's just treated with laser correction. But after a few months, you go back again to -3 because the regression is not related to your change in your axial length or change in your curvature. It's because of poor accommodation of convergence, which needs to be taken care of. And finally, what we important is the type of personality you deal with, because many times a very stressed, or we call it in simple words, a type A personality usually end up with these kind of pseudo regressions because they are always under kind of a spasms. And this is very important for us to have a look at it later. So I did mention about the personality. There are different personality scores. And one of the personality score which we use in our practice is the Eysenck personality scores. It's very important here to understand that at least if I look at the percentages, at least 30 to 35% of them fall into optics. Very little in today's refractive surgery, less than 5% are this. I would put around 80% of my patients today who come with glare, regression, or unhappiness is this. And this are always together, which I feel out of 80%, probably around 75% of that 80% is always the personality, which is kind of a little different. All of the above is always, I would say, around 5% of them would fit into all these three categories. But in today's post-COVID era, this is the most important thing. So whenever a patient comes to you with regression, glare, halos, sudden onset of unexpected symptoms which you can't explain, remember this, concentrate on your ocular motility and you'll always find an answer. Thank you. I would stop sharing my screen. The next speaker is Dr. Pooja. Are you ready? Or Dr. Chaitra would like to speak?
Yes, I'm ready with my presentation. Let me
Hello.
just share. Can I go ahead? Or I think it's Pooja in the next order.
Dr. Chaitra is our retina surgeon, and she's a translation scientist, and she also is joint secretary AIOS. Does a lot of research work. One of the go-to person at NN for anything academic and non-academic. So Dr. Chaitra is going to speak about the role of macular OCT in finding unhappiness, in detecting unhappy patients. Dr. Chaitra.
Thank you, Dr. Rohit, for this opportunity. I would like to elaborate a little bit on, how our fingers can get burnt when we don't really look at the macula before patients undergo surgery, especially anterosegment surgeries, because most often these patients have very, very high expectations with respect to visual outcomes. They're expecting 6/6 unneeded vision. So when we goof up by not looking at the retina, we are going to be in a lot of trouble. I have no financial disclosures. Now, why the OCT is because it's non-invasive, it's very rapid, and most importantly, it gives us a very, very good histological view of the different layers, right from the choroid to the retina. As you can see here, it compares very, very well to the OCT scans that we see. Now, this is a beautiful image which is actually showing you the histology, how well it compares to the ST-OCT layers that we see when we scan these patients on our spectral domain OCTs and our SWEP source. Now, this is a classification that is now currently being used, wherein we can see the different layers and how well delineated each one of them are. So we can actually, by segmentation, pick up errors in any of them, and we can actually prognosticate them vision-wise. So quickly for the younger generation, the postgraduates and the fellows, this is an important table where you can see what is hyperreflective on the OCT and what is hyporeflective, so that you don't get confused. And because the whole idea of why you have these different grayscales on the scan is to help us understand what is normal and what is abnormal, and therefore plan our prognosis and treatment for these patients. More importantly, we also get a quantitative analysis, which we cannot do clinically. We can never actually measure just by clinical examination what is the retinal thickness. And you must remember that different instrumentations give us different segmentation algorithms. In Spectralis, it's from the ILM to the posterior edge of the RP, whereas on the Cirrus, it's from the ILM to the anterior edge of the RP. So when we're looking at retinal thickness, this is another important factor. Other than that, we also get this map of the macular thickness where you can see which quadrant is involved, how far away from the fovea are we seeing edema or abnormality. I'm going to quickly cover some common scenarios that we need to be aware of. Here you can see gross cystoid macular edema with subretinal fluid. This is in a patient with BRVO. This is in a patient with arterial occlusion, this typical whitening. And when you see, loss of the delineation of the different layers, you must immediately think of a CRAO. Now, this is interesting, where you can see a normal and an abnormal. That's because it's a branch arterial occlusion, wherein the occlusive part is white and the normal part is appearing in perfect layers. So this is a clinical image where you can see just a portion of the retina shows the occlusion of the artery. These are common scenarios that we see in patients undergoing cataract surgery. Above, you'll see drusen, and the image below, you can see atrophy. Now, imagine you operate on this patient and the patient's visual acuity is not good after surgery. We are going to have a lot of explaining to do. This is patients with CNVMs, again, very commonly seen in this age group undergoing cataract surgery. And post-treatment, they do tend to improve. ERMs cannot be picked up all the time clinically, especially when they're subtle. This is post-op. It helps you plan combined surgeries. You may want to do cataract and vitrectomy with ERM removal in such a patient. Lamellar macular holes, again, see, especially in the image above, the cataract is dense, the media is hazy, which is why you may miss this, whereas an OCT scan will definitely help document and pick up these lesions, and it becomes very easy to explain. VMT or VMA, vitreomacular traction attachment, again, can cause if not less vision improvement, the quality of the vision will definitely be affected. If you can see here, it's a focal traction on top, and the image below is a broad-based traction. Again, you will need to change your management. These are PEDs that you can see here. This is a patient with PED and CSCR, again, could be missed clinically. So it is important because the macula may look very, very normal on a clinical or slit lamp examination, but they will have significant pathology on the OCT. And also conversely, the macula may look very abnormal, but the OCT could look, it could show absolutely normal macular architecture, which helps you explain to the patient. So like a few clinical examinations, there's a 58-year-old man, 20/25 and 20/40 vision. He had an NS grade 1 with cortical cataract. He was interested in multifocal IOLs. The fundus, if you see the clinical picture, looks pretty normal, but when we did the OCT, there was ERM with retinal thickening. So we did advise the patient to undergo cataract surgery, but asked him not to opt for multifocal IOLs because the quality of vision may not be very good post-op. And this is another example of a 52-year-old patient who presented with moderate cataract. He had previously undergone a retinal detachment surgery. The macular abnormalities, rather appear significant on the color fundus photo, but then the OCT was very well, showed very well preserved layers because it was actually a buccal surgery. So the patient's vision was very good post-op and he was very, very happy. So these are some of the other examples of unhappy patients after cataract surgery. You can see macular holes, you can see VMT with a lamellar hole. We see conditions like PSC, which, again, clinically, especially when the media is a little hazy because the cataract you may not be able to pick up. So when should you image these patients? When the vision does not correlate with the amount of cataract, or if the patient complains of metamorphopsia, if the patient has any suspicions, lesions clinically, and you want to, record them so that you can also make the patient understand as to what's going on. Documentation of conditions that are likely to progress post-surgery. Biggest example of this is diabetic macular edema, because we expect that the patient's edema can worsen, especially if the surgery turns out to be complicated. When the vision loss follows a phase of improvement after surgery as well, imaging is required. Clinical considerations preoperatively, definitely for macular hole, VMTs, epiretinal membranes, and macular edema, and postoperatively for pseudophakic, macular edema, post-vitreous detachment. Sometimes patients come to you looking for progression of DR or progression of age-related macular degeneration. Macular hole can be subtle or clearly visible when it is stage 4, but then when you have smaller holes or earlier holes, you may not be able to pick up. And OCT definitely helps us to monitor, as you can see in these patients, these images. These are the different stages, and again, all patients who had cataract, and therefore the images are a little, hazy and grainy, but then luckily we were able to document them. VMT, I've already shown you. Epiretinal membranes, again, patients may, subtle ERMs, they may not be able to, we may not be able to pick up, and the patient may attribute it to the cataract, but then they can definitely affect the quality of vision post-op, and post-op surgical inflammation itself can cause progression of these membranes. Macular edema, we need to be very cautious. So what we do is we image these patients, especially if they already have pre-existing edema, either treat them pre-op or intra-op with intravitreal pharmacotherapy. It could be steroids or anti-VEGF. This definitely plays a role because post-op inflammation can occur and can worsen the edema. This paper clearly shows that there is increased risk of even developing center-involved macular edema in those who did not even have pre-op edema. This is pseudophakic CME, can occur few months to weeks after cataract surgery. So they will definitely have initial improvement followed by drop in vision. Coming to wet AMD, important cause of vision loss in the elderly, and it can coexist with cataract. Therefore, we need to be cautious in these patients, document, explain, treat, whether before or during surgery. And a pre-op OCT becomes mandatory in them to confirm the diagnosis. So many of us hesitate to use the SC-OCT as a screening tool prior to routine cataract surgery, but why not? Since we are already anyways imaging them, whether to calculate your IOL power, whether we, to ensure that the systemic factors are in position, why not also check the macula for whatever conditions they have. So we did a quick study where we looked at the ST-OCT to identify macular pathology preoperatively. We had a large study population and it's still an ongoing, it was a prospective consecutive study. And we included all patients undergoing cataract in whom we could get, good OCT scans, which would.
Chaitra, if you can summarize it.
Yeah,
Chaitra, if you can summarize this whole thing, you can go to the summary. Because that's the same question I wanted to ask you anyway. What percentage of your patients, yeah, you have written it here, 24% had macular pathologies. And the second question is,
yes.
I think I'll ask the question. If you have slides, you can show it so that will save time. Second question is, through this dense cataract, what kind of an OCT would be better for somebody who wants to invest on a OCT for all the cataract surgery?
Any of the recent OCTs that are available are good. They're much, much better in imaging through even dense cataract, and a line scan is more than adequate. Even if you don't obtain a radial scan, a single line scan through the center of the fovea is more than adequate.
So basically, what you're suggesting is that it is not just for premium cataract surgery, but for all the cataract surgeries, if you're able to image it, it saves you a lot of trouble post-op explaining to them. Am I right?
Yes, yes. It helps us preparing them for the outcome of their cataract surgery. An informed patient would be definitely more cooperative, for post-operative management than somebody who doesn't have any idea.
Perfect. Thank you, Chaitra. And I can stop sharing the thing. I think you have answered most of it. I think the take-home was very clear. I think let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Lucy. Can you speak now?
Yes, sir. I'll share
Dr. Lucy is a prolific cataract and refractive surgeon at NN, and also great mentor, teacher to many, many batches of fellows. Also very good in writing papers, books, a multitask personality. He's going to speak about optical calculation blunders in IOL power calculation. That's an area of interest as a researcher also. Dr. Lucy.
Thank you, sir, for the kind introduction. So as sir spoke in his talk also about the optics, how it plays an important role in refractive surgery, so it does in cataract surgery as well. We need to understand each of these optical elements, starting from tear film, going right up to the retina, in order to find answers and avoid these blunders that happen in IOL power calculation. So let me start with few cases. So our first case is that of a 56-year-old gentleman who had come with decreased vision in the left eye. He had grade 2 nuclear sclerosis cataract. Patient was a dry eye patient. He had punctate epithelial erosions all over the cornea, which we had missed prior to doing the workup. And in his initial workup, we could see that there was astigmatism of about 4.59 diopters. If we had planned toric IOL based on these values, we would have gone with an SN689 value. But thankfully, we had picked up his dry eye and didn't go ahead with the cataract surgery. After treating the dry eye of this patient, when we repeated the biometry, we saw that the astigmatism now had significantly reduced to about 1.84. So if we had gone with the prior one, we would have ended up with a refractive surprise, as the correct model of IOL is around SN685. Sorry. So treating the dry eye or maintaining the first optical element of the eye is of utmost importance to avoid these blunders in IOL power calculation. Moving on, the earlier studies have shown that this dry eye affects the topography values. Sorry. Similar is the thing with biometry. So when there is a good tear film, the light rays which are entering the eye would be reflected back in a proper way. However, when the tear film is bad, these light rays which go inside the eye will be distorted, thereby getting us abnormal values. These abnormal values are not just important to get the keratometry for toric IOLs, but also to have a proper keratometry to get our IOL power calculations in the proper way. Moving on to the next refractive element, that is the cornea. We know that the normal cornea is okay to go ahead with the IOL power calculation. But when the cornea is treated, as in for a refractive surgery, or when there are ectatic conditions present, or post-keratoplasty, or any causes which lead to irregular cornea, these are the cases where the optics are slightly altered or deviated from normal. Now, giving an example, this was a 55-year-old gentleman who had hyperopic LASIK done 2 years back. So whenever there is treatment of cornea by any ablative procedure or incisional procedure, this alters the keratometric index error, and instead of it being the normal 1.3375, it is altered as the anterior to posterior ratio of the cornea is changed. There is a change in radius of curvature, effective lens position prediction becomes difficult, and there are other factors which get affected, like the asphericity of the cornea, the tear film, whose role we saw in the prior case. It might induce irregular astigmatism also and affects the biomechanical instability. Now, when we have all these alterations, going ahead with the normal anterior corneal values for our IOL power calculation would give us erroneous results. So we need to calculate both anterior as well as posterior cornea, which is done very well using the equivalent K reading values, and it gives us simulated values to be used in our IOL formulae. The role of ASCRS online calculator and Barrett 2K calculator for these post-refractive surgery eyes has very well been proven. So for this patient, our IOL power would have come to around 15.5. This is another case, a 40-year-old lady who had come to us with cataract. She had advanced keratoconus in her eyes, for which she was using scleral contact lenses. She wanted to go ahead with cataract surgery. And wanted to be free of glasses. There are enough papers which talk about the use of toric IOLs in cases of advanced keratoconus or post-penetrating keratoplasty, but most of them have reported of having residual astigmatism after the surgery. So in these cases also, the first question comes where to take the keratometry from. As we saw in the initial scan, there was an astigmatism of around 10 diopters in the FORMAPS refractive. But when we evaluate both anterior and posterior using the equivalent K reading, we see that the amount of astigmatism in the central cornea, as is also seen that the main part of the cone in the pupillary area is lesser. However, the cone is more inferiorly displaced. But if we see the scan, the axis is highly varying in each zone. There is almost 10 degrees of difference in the axis of astigmatism in each zone, which says that this cornea is highly irregularly irregular. But why was that so? So probably this was because of the use of scleral lenses, and that could be a contact lens warpage. When we asked the same patient to come back to us after discontinuing his scleral lenses for 3 weeks, we saw that the cornea is much more regular now. You can see the axis variation is lesser than 3 degrees, 3 to 4 degrees in the central zone. Now, since the cone is very much in the center and her pupillary diameter is around 3 millimeter, it is imperative to use these values and not the values that you get measuring based on biometry or SIMK values. We have the updated Kane formula, which takes into account keratoconic eyes specifically for selecting toric in these cases. So a knowledge of what is the updated formula available is also imperative to avoid these optical blunders. Moving on further comes the role of the lens. This lens is useful, gives us the effective lens position. It has an influence on IOL power calculation, and it also detects the optical axis. The role of lens thickness in predicting the effective lens position has been given. What exactly happens is when we have a fixed primary lens and a screen, the secondary lens and its position is important to determine the effective power of the entire system. Also, the lens is important to determine the optical and visual axis of the eye. Now, the angle alpha, which is the determinant of the centration of the bag and its role in multifocal, is highlighted in multiple studies. But the same plays an important role in monofocal lenses, especially the newer generation aspheric monofocal lenses. Even the slight decentration in these cases causes distorted vision and affects the quality of vision metrics. Moving on further, when the vitreous of the eye is replaced with silicone oil or any other changes in the media, when we do the calculation for these cases, initially it used to be that manually a conversion factor of 0.71 could be applied, but newer generation biometers have this different mode like silicone oil filled mode for calculation in such cases. Now, one such case example of a 25-year-old myope who had retinal detachment and was operated for the same. Prior to surgery, a scan was taken and she showed myopia of axial length of around 34 millimeters. But post-procedure, when she was planned for silicone oil removal along with cataract, the axial length came out to be 28. Now, if we use these two biometry values, based on the initial axial length, her power comes around minus 4.5, and the second axial length gives it up to 7. Which one is correct? This case is again related to another case which I'm coming further, which moves on to retina, that there are cases of posterior staphyloma seen in high myopes. In such cases also, like in this case, we went ahead with our biometer and implanted the IOL. But post-operative, we had refractive surprise of 6 diopters. Why was that so? In cases of high myopes, where the optical biometer doesn't capture the scan, and if we go with immersion, it doesn't maintain the axis along the optical axis. Sometimes it would take the area of staphyloma into account, and sometimes it would ignore. This would.
Lucy, can you summarize?
Yes, I'm done.
Summarize?
Yes. So to summarize, I would say that each of the optical elements, starting from tear film, going right up to the macula, is important. A brief understanding of each structure and its role in IOL power calculation, plus the knowledge of new formula and calculation, is important to have happy patients. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. And I'll ask question to you, but I'd like to ask Dr. Sharon to get herself ready with the presentation. Lucy, can you just mention something about the Kane formula? Sharon, are you ready?
So, Kane.
Okay. Just 1 minute. I will just get your presentation ready, load your, keep it, then I will. Then Lucy, would you like to mention till he's getting ready about the Kane formula?
Is a new artificial intelligence-based formula developed by Dr. Kane from Australia. So he has done a regression analysis of lot of data collected from different places, from Europe, from Australia, and multiple other centers. And he's come up with newer parameters which takes into account multiple factors like the
what newer parameters? What new? If you can summarize the 1 or 2 new parameters he's taken.
Yes, sir. So he takes into account the gender of the patient, which was not there in other cases, and then the effective lens position, white to white, and ACD. So
why do you think gender will have a role here?
That we are not very sure, sir. But in his formula, even the gender needs to be specified. And he has had multiple results in varying axial lengths also, be it smaller eye, larger eye, keratoconic eyes. And that's data of large number of patients. So probably that is something new which would work better. Our initial results are good with it.
So you use this form for your keratoconic and irregular corneas?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So I'll come back to you later on each one of you can pick up one of the biggest blunders they had and what lessons they learned. So you can keep that running in your mind so that when I ask you, each one of you get a minute to answer that at the end of it. Okay. So introduce my colleague and good friend, Dr. Sharon D'Souza. Her area of work is cornea ocular surface refractive surgery. She's a PhD on ocular immune trafficking, which she's going to complete this year. Her biggest source of worry always is why ocular lubricants don't work and what do we do with the newer lubricants. Sharon, all yours.
Thank you very much. As Dr. Rohit was saying, very often we see these patients in our OPD whom we think have dry eye. We've given some lubricants and we hope they do well. And they should have done well, but unfortunately they come back sometime later without feeling much better or sometimes feeling worse and complaining miserably. And that's not something that anyone wants to see in your OPD. So today we're trying to analyze what could be going wrong and why lubricants don't work. So when we look at dry eye itself, we know that sometimes the diagnosis, even though it seems like a very simple condition, sometimes the diagnosis itself may have missed us because there are mimickers, like even an ocular allergy could mimic a dry eye. Sometimes there may be a mismatch between the type of dry eye and the lubricating drops, and we'll highlight a little more about that. And there may be other known risk factors associated, especially the systemic collagen vascular diseases, thyroid, rosacea, which we may have missed. And there may be some additional issues in the eye like blepharitis, MGD, Demodex. There may be a cicatrizing condition. And all of these may be contributing to the lack of response to this patient. So coming to the accurate diagnosis and subdiagnosis, I won't dwell much on this because we all know the new definition is much more in depth, and the dry eye now is much more multifactorial with the loss of homeostasis, hyperosmolarity, and inflammation. But when we look at it from this broad aspect, then of course we understand that our lubricants in some cases may be woefully inadequate. Because our dry eye then, to simplify it, is not just a decrease in the tear components, aqueous, lipid, or mucin. There's also inflammation there. There may be corneal nerve related changes. There's definitely hyperosmolarity, and there can be changes like autophagy and desiccation, which result in epithelial changes. So when you look at it from this comprehensive view, we do realize that we have to look at it in a much more broad way to try and treat these patients. So when we say there's a mismatch in disease and therapy, we have to look at the type of dry eye and the type of lubricating drops. So which is the ideal lubricating drop? So ideally, we would want a drop which would try and complete, treat all of these problems that we talked about, replenish the aqueous, lipid, mucin, have an anti-inflammatory effect, promote nerve growth, maintain the osmolarity, reduce desiccation, pH, everything. But unfortunately, we do realize that so much of multitasking is probably not possible by a mere drop. So the reality is that we do need to use permutations and combinations of various medications that we have at hand. So very important is to know your tear components. So broadly, when we look at tears, we know that most of them are water-based or aqueous-based. There are certain oil-based components, but very few. And these are on the right side, you can see the list out of all the various compositions of the various drops. The oil-based, as I was saying, are very few, especially in India. The few that we have are, some paraffin-based medications and some which have castor oil in them. So that would be relegated to use if you have a very strong lipid deficiency. But usually we would stick to the more common ones which are available to us. For a lubricant to be effective in reducing the desiccation, which is basically the drying on the surface and the resultant problems, the surface retention has to be very good. And when we understand anything about surface retention, it means that it would depend on a lot of other factors, including the pH, the blink rate of the patient, the evaporation rate from the surface. So what is shocking to know is that, even though we give lubricants maybe 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, the maximum a lubricant actually stays is usually less than a minute. The best one, even sodium hyaluronate, which is supposed to be one of the newer lubricants, still has quite a low retention rate. So we usually, in a more severe dry eye, we definitely need to have a much higher frequency of installation. Another important thing, and this is relevant for us in India, is that many of the lubricants at a higher temperature become less viscous. So you'd often see patients who come back and say that, when they keep it in the fridge and use, they feel much better. And I always attributed it to the fact that it was cooler and then gave some relief. But the fact of the matter is that it also has an increased viscosity and helps the tears remain on the ocular surface a little longer. And that's also adding to it. Coming to the inflammation, of course, inflammation of varying grades underlies DED of any etiology. Sometimes we may not even see the classic signs of inflammation like redness or congestion, but it's still there, smoldering there. And that we can see very often on our confocal, or a very easy tool is by using a questionnaire which would show the high symptomatology of these patients. We need to treat these patients with appropriate anti-inflammatory medications. And of course, with a lot of congestion or a lot of inflammation, you need a short course of topical steroids. Usually a soft steroid is adequate, but more severe dry eyes require long-term use of cyclosporin. Usually the most common is 0.05 eye drops. And when we say long-term, at least 3 to 6 months. What we must know about cyclosporin, and we've studied this in detail and published as well on how it helps in both inflammation and reducing nociception, is that you can get preservative-free and those with preservatives. Of course, we know that for a more severe dry, we prefer a preservative-free. It comes in 2 concentrations of 0.05 and 0.1. The more common ones we use is 0.05. And you also have aqueous-based and oil-based emulsion. No financial disclosure, but the one we have, preservative-free Emu drops, for example, is an aqueous-based, and Restasis is an oil-based emulsion. The osmolarity is another point which is very important to remember when we are treating dry eye. And we have certain osmoprotectant drops, and they contain things like betaine, L-carnitine, or erythritol. Now, when we know there's a hyperosmolar situation going on, we try to have either an isoosmolar or a hypoosmolar drops, which will then counteract the hyperosmolarity. Again, no financial disclosure, but the most common drops available to us as osmoprotectants are Osmodrops and Optiv, and hypoosmolar, even the hyaluronate-based drops have hypoosmolar versions of them. Autophagy is something which has become very, very come into the limelight, a lot, because we found that once the autophagy increases, it reduces the inflammation on the human ocular cells. So it mitigates stress-induced inflammation, and trehalose, which is now a very commonly used medication in dry eye medications, augments this autophagy. So it has an extra role to play and not just a lubricating role, which is very, very important. Preservatives, of course, we know a lot about it. It's once we have a preservative like BAK, it would add to the toxicity on an already damaged surface. So we try to keep those which have what are called as the disappearing preservatives, which basically oxidize to a non-toxic substance like purite. pH is also very important. I'll just highlight the most important point, that certain medications like the polyols have HB-GOR, and HB-GOR turns to gel at 7.5, which increases the retention time. But what we must know is that if you combine it with other medications, especially if you're treating an infection, then those medications have a very low pH. So then it's totally counterproductive trying to mix these two medications. Systemic involvement, of course, with dry eye is another very important reason why our medications may not work. We just have to remember the most common ones, and definitely if you suspect, especially in more severe conditions, we have to evaluate for them in a lot of detail. Another very important feature is the other points, like look at the lids very carefully, look if ask the history, what kind of occupation they have, whether they are contact lens users. Orthoptics is something that has really, changed the way we practice. A lot of patients who come in thinking that they have dry eye, because they do often diagnose themselves, or even if we think that they have dry eye and not responding, have shown significant changes on their, accommodative insufficiency or convergence insufficiency and other changes, and respond dramatically to exercise. A very common thing is partial blinkers, and we don't even realize, but it's important to look for partial blinkers, and something like Demodex is extremely common. The future lies in trying to get all this, easy point of care diagnostic kit, so that we can check for nerve-related changes, check for inflammation, and then targeted, customized treatment would be the way forward. Thank you very much for a very patient listening.
Thank you, Sharon. Karik, get yourself ready, and I will ask some questions for Sharon. One important point, you covered virtually everything. If somebody has if somebody can look at your presentation once or twice, they probably will understand everything about all the lubricants prescribed. I would like to ask you two questions. It's just to bring the same concept again. Do you ask your patients to keep all the lubricating drops in the refrigerator, or specifically ones?
Yeah, so not all of them, but definitely the cyclosporin, especially the preservative-free, have to be kept in the refrigerator. So that's essential. And the lubricating drops, recently, after finding this, I've started telling them to use. So you have to keep it in the door of the refrigerator. Otherwise, they'll put it in the deep freeze and freeze it. But in the door helps. Nothing else. So even if they keep it out, it's okay. But these medications
should, because it stimulates your cold thermoreceptors, yes, and all that changes. Second question is, you did mention about aminoglycosides and combining the counterproductive combining of. Can you just explain it a little more, because it's important that when people write antibiotics, they write some preservative, some lubricant. So when you feel that, based on that point, you feel that when you write all these antibiotics, you should write HB-GOR related lubricating drops?
So actually, it's specifically for medications which lower the pH. So for our ulcers, we do use a lot of cyclopentolate. Sometimes we use fortified medications like aminoglycosides, which are all low pH. They are on the acidic side. So in that case, we shouldn't be using something with HB-GOR, which actually needs a higher pH to be activated. So there, even if you're mixing the fortified drops, it's better not to use something like Cysteine Ultra. You can use a CMC based. It's
Okay.
fine.
Basically,
if people think that we'll use a better drop and it will act better or something, it's like
perfect, fantastic. So use CMC based one when you want to make a drop preparation, not something which lowers the pH. Fantastic, Sharon. Good insight. I'd like to invite Dr. Gairik Kundu. He is a cornea refractive surgeon. Also, he has his PhD work on AI, artificial intelligence in refractive surgery. Dr. Gairik, all yours.
Thank you, Rohit sir, and thank you very much for this chance. I'll be speaking on PRK haze, what would we miss? Now, post PRK or even post cross linking, many times the surgery has gone on well, but still these patients have unfavorable outcomes. Now, haze is something which is not very, very well understood. And there have been publications which have looked at, looking at PRK haze, whether it's early PRK haze or late PRK haze. But majority of the work done earlier was based on intraoperative factors, the use of mitomycin C, and that's what they restricted themselves to. Specific, stratification of factors, whether it is intraoperative or post-operative, and how we can actually customize each one of these factors is something which we did not come across, and that's what we wanted to dwell at. So there are, multiple risk factors, and we wanted to develop a risk scoring system utilizing our database for PRK patients and whether that could help us in improving our outcomes. So we did a study which looked at both a retrospective analysis, which is PRK patients, 238 of them who were operated between 2013 and 16. And we wanted to look at various risk factors which can accelerate or which can lead to development of PRK haze. We wanted to use this knowledge of the retrospective data and apply a novel score to the prospective arm, which looked at rituals or ways in which we can actually decrease the incidence of post PRK haze. So that's what we wanted to look at. So when we looked at the retrospective data, which included an analysis of 238 patients, we found surprisingly, 9% of them had haze. Now, there are ways of classifying or looking at haze. The most commonly one clinical evaluation is known as the Fantes classification. We also objectively looked at analyzing haze, which is using densitometry. Now, the various factors, I'll be coming to it as to why we looked at it, was factors which could increase preoperative inflammation, which included presence of dry eyes. We did a thorough dry eye evaluation. Patients at outset having a high OSDI, low vitamin D, presence of contact lens intolerance, and also looking at whether UV rays can lead to a persistence or accelerate the presence of haze, which is post PRK. So these were the two groups. We had 22 eyes in the patients out of 238 who did develop significant haze, and we compared this to the controls who had no haze. And important information is many of the factors, such as whether they had a high OSDI or a meibomian gland dropout, which is an objective measurement, or vitamin D levels and a working environment, which is outdoor, were quite significantly different in the group with haze versus those without haze. So why did we come across this information and why did we look at this? So this is a work which we've already published, which looks at predictive factors which help in developing post-surgical haze. And what we found is that inflammation did lead to an altered wound healing. Now, it's important for us to understand, wound healing post-PRK. In an ideal situation, post-surgery, post any insult, in this case, it's a surgery, there would be an activation of keratinocytes, which would lead to the formation of myofibroblasts and fibroblasts. These under normal healing conditions would undergo apoptosis and would not lead to that development of haze. But what happens is in cases of stressors, in cases of raised inflammation preoperatively, these activated keratinocytes do lead to the formation of an excess myofibroblasts, and this do not apoptosize and can lead to the formation of aberrant collagen, and that's what leads to presence of more haze post the procedure, in this case, which is PRK. Now, we had used all of these factors, our understanding and knowledge about these various risk stratifications of the retrospective arm, and we wanted to then utilize this knowledge for our prospective arm, where over 450 eyes were looked at. We devised a novel scoring, which I'll come to, And we wanted to see what effect does it have on his. Now, the various risk scoring systems is a scoring system which we devised, included looking at the OSDI, which gives us an information about the preoperative inflammation. It's an easy way of doing that. Vitamin D levels, we classified it as 10, less than 10 having a score of 3 and more than 10 having a score of 1. Contact lens intolerance, which was also important because chronic contact lens intolerance can lead to an unhealthy ocular surface and can predispose to higher preoperative inflammation. And objective assessment of meibomian gland dropouts is also what was important. And of course, finding out and figuring out the patients who had more of an outdoor activity, because there have been work which is published, which has looked at correlation between ultraviolet radiation and the incidence of post-PRK His. So we classified it, less than 5 was low risk, 5 to 10 moderate, and less than 10 more is a high risk. So what is perfect? What is PRK perfect? This is an acronym which looks at prediction, examination, treatment, following up these patients, and also an arm which looks at a chronic evaluation or chronic treatment of late onset post PRK His. Preoperatively, ideally patients less than 5 would, you can take up these patients for surgery. But if they have a moderate or high risk, it's important that we control their preoperative inflammation, which can be through, using doxycycline, which is an MMP9 inhibitor, topical steroids, a cyclosporin, and very importantly, correcting their nutritional imbalances. If cases of patients who have a vitamin D deficiency, it's important to treat that prior to taking them up for surgery. Intraoperatively, we have also published on the role of, NSAID, such as an Acuvale, which is an ketorolac. It does help in alleviating pain, no doubt, but also ketorolac intraoperative, soaked BCLs help in reduction of pro-inflammatory markers. And this helps us in optimizing wound healing post-PRK. Post-operatively, it's important that, if you look at a score which is less than 5, ideally you can start off with a low potency, either loteprednol or fluorometholone, and look at lubricating drops. But if the score is greater than 10, you look at, again, treating inflammation for a longer period of time. Start off with a high potency steroid for 2 weeks and then step it down. Importance is continuing lubricants for a longer period of time and topical immunomodulators such as cyclosporin. So what was important is that there was a significant reduction in the interventional prospective arm, where when we did the retrospective study, there was a 9% reduction per incidence of His. But utilizing our scoring, the reduction, the presence of His was significantly reduced to 2%. So this is what we published recently in the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology, where it can be a useful way for all clinicians to stratify and use these parameters so as to improve outcomes post PRK. So ritual is one aspect, but translating this into practice is certainly an important aspect. So to take home message is that preoperative risk stratification is very, very important. It does help us in triaging patients, and utilizing the score is very useful in decreasing post-operative, post-PRK corneal haze. And I would like to, it's an honor to be a part of the team which published this paper in the refractive edition in IGO, and this was awarded the IGO Silver Award in this AIOS. Thank you for your patient listening.
Congratulations on that award, Eric.
Oh, thanks, ma'am.
Our next speaker is Pooja, is it?
Yeah.
Pooja, are you ready to share your presentation?
Pooja is on the other side. I think Palak can do it.
Okay.
Chaitra, I'll introduce Palak, so I'll be there on the other side. Introduce
Sure.
Palak, please.
So welcoming Palak to this instruction course. Palak has been an alumni of Narayan Nethralaya, and she's done some excellent work here. And over to you, Palak, for your presentation, and we can have a little bit of discussion, once Dr. Rohit and Pooja are back.
Thank you, ma'am, for that kind introduction. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Rohit sir and everyone on the team for making me part of this IC. So today, these series of cases, I call them the little things matter. in these series of cases, I would basically describe the small lessons which I have learned during my fellowship and how they have helped me treat my patients better. So the first case is a case of 60-year-old male who had come to me for complaints with blurred vision since 3 to 4 months, which was gradual, progressive, and painless. He was already consulting 2-3 doctors elsewhere, and he was being advised cataract surgery. So on examination, it was seen that right eye, the vision was 6.9 and the left eye was 6.24, which wasn't improving. Rest of the anterior segment was normal. In the right eye, the lens showed NS1 grade cataract. The left eye showed NS2 with PSC. And on examination of the fundus, it appeared grossly normal. Now, this patient had no systemic illness, and I advised him cataract surgery in the left eye. This patient particularly wanted freedom for glasses. One, he was not very keen to wear these glasses. And secondly, also because he had insurance and he wanted to make the best use of it by putting the premium lens. Now, as we have been taught in the fellowship, the workup for any premium lens started with a dry eye workup where Schirmer's test was done, PBUT was done, and after that, corneal topography was done, which was normal, and the astigmatism was less than 0.75. So a multifocal IOL was planned after counseling. But here is where a very important lesson which we learned during our fellowship came. Was this workup complete? No, the OCT was still remaining. As Chaitra ma'am rightly said in her talk, OCT in cataract patients preoperatively becomes very important, especially in these premium cases where they want premium lenses. So this was what the OCT was showing for this patient. There was a pigment epithelium defect. So after retina consultation, the multifocal IOL plan was deferred and a monofocal IOL was planned under guarded visual prognosis. So the little things which matter here is never to forget the checklist which we have been taught every time that any patient comes for a premium surgery. There has to be a detailed history and examination, a proper dry eye workup, corneal topography, biometry, and OCT. And of course, a proper systemic workup. Coming to the second case, this is a case of 53-year-old female who was referred for problems in disc and disc basically. So for glaucoma and retina evaluation, the patient came from nearby city from Nagpur. The patient was complaining of decreased vision gradually over 1 year, and she had no other systemic illness. On examination, her visual acuity was 612 in right eye, N8, and the left eye was 624, N8. The anterior segment was quite normal and there were no cataractous changes. So the anterior segment findings did not match the vision. Also on posterior examination, there was mild pallor of the disc in both the eyes. Rest of the fundus appeared normal. Now, since the patient was specifically referred for glaucoma evaluation, there was disc pallor and decreased vision. I planned HFA 30-2. On HFA, this was the picture which was seen. Now, looking carefully at the patient, the face and the hands which previously appeared normal now appeared to be pathological. This was how her face looked. It was a acromegalic facies. There were broadened hands with excessive soft tissue. When on asking again about the history of such features, the patient said that she had previously also complained about this to some other physician who had just told her that she had calcium deficiency and was just given calcium supplements. And that is how she was continuing since so many years. So MRI brain was planned and neurology opinion was taken. On MRI brain, this is what we found, that she had pituitary macroadenoma, which was 40 mm large, that is approximately 4 centimeters. And this was not taken care since so many years. So it was a long-standing tumor which was missed at several checkups. It was already affecting the vision, and if now left untreated, would lead to blindness in her. So surgical excision had now become mandatory for her. So eye, as we all know, can be window to brain. So little things like looking at the facial features, the hands, taking the history of the patient becomes important to find out bigger problems lying underneath. Now, this is another case. This is an old case which I had seen during my fellowship. It was a case of 20-year-old male who was post-LASIK and had come to Narayan Nethralaya with all these complaints of ocular discomfort, intermittent glare and halos, intermittent ghosting and doubling of vision since 2 years. So we went ahead and asked the history. We also found that he was not very happy-go-lucky kind of personality and had little problems like depression and anxiety intermittently. On clinical examination, the unaided vision was 6/6 for him. The retinoscopy did not show any significant refractive error. The extraocular movement were full and free, and there was orthophoria for distance and near. Now we went ahead and did the dry eye workup. Schirmer's for both eyes was pretty normal, the Schirmer's 1 and Schirmer's 2. TBUT was also within normal range, and there was no ocular stain. And on meibography, there was no gross loss of any glands. So what was the reason for doubling of the vision or ghosting of images? As sir already mentioned in his talk, where we begin our IC, it could be due to decentered ablation, or was it because of pseudo-accommodative spasm, which was again not there when we saw on eye trace? Then could it be because of abnormal tear optics? Again, the dry eye workup was also normal, and on OCAS also, it wasn't there. Now, the next important thing which we have been talking throughout the IC was orthoptic evaluation. On orthoptic evaluation of this patient, it was seen that the accommodation and the vergence was low. So this was a dysfunction of vergence facility. A simple exercise and maybe little bit of counseling for this patient helped him to relieve his problems. So the little things like orthoptic workup should not be missed. Now, this is another case which I'm particularly presenting for seeking opinion from everyone on the panel. This was a case of 22-year-old female who had come for refractive surgery. She was pursuing her master's as well as doing job in US and has come to India during the lockdown period. And she planned to get her refractive surgery done. So here we are looking at a girl with glasses with high screen time of approximately more than 14 hours. This was her refractive error. So she needed basically a refractive surgery only in one eye, that is right eye. Now on anterior segment and posterior segment examination, it was pretty normal. And on systemic examination, she was a case of acne rosacea and was on treatment. This was her topography, which was pretty normal again. I counseled her for LASIK, trans-PRK and PRK, and also explained the possibility of dry eye looking at the profile of the patient with high screen time. The patient opted for trans-PRK. The surgery went uneventful and I used MMC for 35 seconds. Post-operatively, she was started on antibiotic, but post-operatively, there was little delayed epithelium healing and I could remove contact lens only after a week. After removing the contact lens, there was slight epithelium heaping in the center, which resolved gradually over a week. The vision after 3 weeks of surgery was 6/9, but the patient was still not very happy with the vision. And she complained that it is not very crisp and clear. So I continued the steroid and lubricants and added cyclosporin eye drops as well. The steroids were slowly tapered over 8 weeks. After 3 months, when she presented, she still had vision of 6/9 parts, and she was still not happy with the quality of vision and complained of blurring of vision. This is what was seen on anterior segment examination. There was a mild corneal gaze, and this is what was the OCT picture, anterior segment OCT. Now, my question is, it was a low myopia case. Everything, all the ocular examination was normal. The ocular surface looked pretty normal. The surgery went uneventful. So why did this patient ended up in haze, even though MMC was used intraoperatively? I searched for literature and could not find any association in particularly between acne rosacea and PRK haze.
So I think can stop this here and we'll discuss this case. We have 5 more minutes before Pooja joins. We're well within the normal time because she has just 8 minutes presentation. Basically, your patient is anisometropia. That's one.
Yes.
Minus
yes.
2.5 and 0.5.
Yes.
that means that they will have a lot of fusional issues to begin with. So even though they are balancing it, minute you take the balance off, all the fusional component come into picture. That is what is causing her the change. The second is patient with acne. I don't know what treatment she was on, isotretinoin or one of the strong anti-acne medications are known to create a lot of inflammation in the eyes, and they create a very slow wound healing. So your case actually follows a nice pattern of acne patients. Check for vitamin D. A lot of acne people have vitamin D deficiency. A lot of them have issues regarding delayed healing. If she's on isotretinoin and one of these products, definitely it will compromise on the healing.
So she is on isotretinoin.
Exactly. So what is interesting here is a combination triad of three things. Anisometropia with an inherent fusional issues, which is 100% there. You treated her, and because you treated her, she was on acne medications. When you treat her on acne medication, the acne medication delays the wound healing. And when you delay a wound healing, it will end up in scarring, because the pathway of scarring, as Gairik said, is not related to your mitomycin. Once you have a delayed in wound healing, when the patient, you have told the patient, a lot of us tell the patient in 3 days your cornea heals. When your patient don't heal on the second day, and when you tell them it's going to take longer, suddenly they go into a stress mode. When they go into a stress mode, the component of accommodative spasm comes in. So she has a delayed wound healing triggered accommodative spasm, which is inherently there because of a previous anisometropic component, which she is suffering now. All you can do is, the problem of haze is not on the visual axis, so ignore it. And it will probably, you don't even need to worry about it, it'll go off. You have to worry about her accommodative component. Find a person who can give her accommodative flipper or exercises that will take care of it. So this is what we need to do.
Thank
Sharon, you want to add anything to it? Am I on the right? Are you on the right page, or you want to add anything to this?
No, absolutely the same page. So as I was saying, acne rosacea classically we've seen it also that once they're on treatment, they have these issues with healing both on the skin, and of course they will have secondary to the acne, they may have some dry eye issues also. I think you checked all that, but their lids will be bad also because of the rosacea. So that also adds to the inflammation on the surface. So definitely.
And
I
acne
would like to ask, could LASIK would have been a better option? Was I wrong in doing trans PRK? Or?
No, LASIK, trans PRK just got you the small scar, which I think is insignificant. LASIK would have created exactly the same amount of defocusing issue. I would say this entire problem is triggered by ocular motility. In fact, LASIK would have worsened because LASIK would have created more nerve cut changes, and she would have probably end up in more dry eye neuropathic pain. So you probably are in that way okay, because nerves heal better. Keep them on lubricants, and the scar will disappear over time. Pooja, are you joined here?
We have one question actually in the chat box.
Yeah, please.
Answered,
keep it. No, please keep it going.
Yeah, Sharon, I think you can take this question. Role of HA containing ocular lubricants in post-refractive surgery patients.
Yeah, so hyaluronate based, I think they're talking about HA means hyaluronate, dual action. So again, very useful. So definitely a good idea.
Formulation for these patients, which they can probably even use long term, just to keep their ocular surface even, or something to make them more comfortable.
So there are two aspects to that, Chaitra, and it's very common post surgery, even though we feel that we've touched maybe the conjunctiva or sclera minimally, or it looks quite pristine, but there would still be changes, and these patients can complain of irritation, burning, which goes on months after surgery as well. So if it's very mild and you just want to use a lubricant, then it doesn't matter what you use, frankly. But again, a preservative-free medication, many of the hyaluronate based are very good for these patients. Of course, you have to see their affordability. But if they've been coming back repeatedly with these complaints, then it's a good idea to add on cyclosporin for some time. They do remarkably well. All their symptoms, come down, because otherwise it's a pristine eye. You're very happy with the surgery. Everyone's happy, but they are still complaining. Their vision would have improved, but they are still complaining about that thing. And I've seen this even with cataract patients sometimes, who have this. So it works very well. So it shows a good.
Chaitra, the other thing you can do is those who are really bitterly complaining, this applies to Dr. Palak's and your case. There is a definite role for an eyelight or an LipiFlow in these patients, especially Palak's case. If you have to do this again, Dr. Palak, if you have this case again, and you have to go back and do like your mistake, what you can do is, one is get an orthoptics evaluation, explain to the patient that there is a chance of you going into this. If you have access and if there is a very low weakness, then do an exercise before it, take a consent form before. Wait for her to stop the isoretinoid, or you can bypass it by doing a smile. That will bypass the entire thing. If you don't have access to smile, do an eyelight or a LipiFlow, reduce the inflammation, wait for a week and do it. And pre-start the patient on a cyclosporin. This is what would probably, in theory, give you the best thing. And for retina and non-refractive cornea surgeons, there's a lot of resistance about writing cyclosporin drops. They think that you're writing an anti-cancer medication. We write it for every patient we see, especially in today's context. I don't want to be too liberal here, but when you need, don't write in today's context. Just writing some HA or one of the water-based things is not going to work, because all your dry eye today is inflammatory driven, especially if you've done a vitreoretinal surgery where you have damaged the conjunctiva. Invariably, you have all the ocular surface damaged there. So I would prefer that be liberal in writing immune drops like a cataract surgeons. You just take the conjunctiva off, and we are very aggressive in writing because they changes. You are cutting many times. Now your ports are smaller, but your time during the microscope is longer. Let's be very clear, microscope light is not a very safe, and safe, but it is not, it creates a lot of changes, and your betadine also changes a lot on your ocular surface. So what I would suggest is, wherever there is necessity, be liberal in writing it, because if you don't start it early, if you really start it late, it doesn't work. And retina surgeons and glaucoma surgeons also be more proactive in sending your patients or doing it yourself, eyelight, LipiFlow, because you will get probably better results. And if Palak's case, if she's affordable, you can even now think about a LipiFlow or something, but orthoptics is the definite one. Pooja, are you here?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Okay, this is the last talk. We had a good discussion, and let's finish it off in next 8 minutes time, so that we'll be finishing before the time.
Just 1 minute. Very good afternoon to all. So I'm just going to share one small talk on how important it is for us to when to cross-link, how to cross-link, and why some consequences happen post cross-linking. At the outset, I have no financial disclosures. So this is one case example where pre-operatively you can see it's a 384 cornea, a grade and 51 diopter of Kmax. And we did this patient, we did a cross-linking, just a manual cross-linking for this patient. And post-operatively 1 year, you can see that patient has flattened by around 2 to 3 diopters. And on densitometry, there is no evidence of haze or scar. And even on slit lamp examination, you can see that there is not significant haze present. This is a second case example again, where we did a manual cross-linking for the patient, and post-operatively, yes, the patient is stable. There is not significant flattening present or progression here. And again, no evidence of haze or scar. Densitometry is again normal, and slit lamp examination is also normal. However, this is the third case where we have done a cross-linking. It's just a manual cross-linking, a disclaimer here. And post-operatively at 1 year, if you can see here, that patient has flattened by around almost 7 diopters in just 1 year. And the another interesting thing is, yes, the patient's visual acuity, the best corrected visual acuity has also reduced. So when we did, and this is the slit lamp examination of the patient, there is a scar present here. And again, the densitometry also shows that there is some amount of scarring present. So just what happened here, why are there 3 similar kind of patients? We've done the same procedure for all 3 patients, but these 3 patients have different outcomes. One has not, one is just the same, one has flattened by around 2 to 3 diopters, and the third patient has flattened excessively and also has landed up in a scar. So our group has published this work where they have said that the amount of LOX and collagen, like, with increasing grades of keratoconus, the LOX and the collagen reduces. And higher the LOX or collagen, there are optimal outcomes, and lower it has suboptimal outcomes. But the question here was that how do we image it in our clinic? So these are the same 3 case examples. We did a polarization sensitive OCT for this patient, which can help us image the orientation and the arrangement of the collagen fibers in the cornea. So you can see here that these are the 3 patients with similar grade of KC and similar curvature. But the collagen orientation, if you see here, the more the blue you see, that means it's darker. Darker the blue you see, it means the better the collagen orientation is. And lighter the blue or yellow or red, which you see, it means the orientation and the arrangement is on the weaker side. So if you can see here, the first patient has relatively a good collagen orientation and arrangement. Here it is a little bit lesser. It is still good, but little bit lesser. And here, if you can see that there is hardly any collagen orientation present here, and the fibrils are just not attached to each other. They are just scattered. And when we compare them with the LOX and collagen, the patient with, this is based on our work, the good collagen orientation has good amount of LOX and collagen present, followed by a little bit weakening of the LOX and collagen with these 3 cases. And once we did the cross-linking on them, this is like the first patient had flattened excessively, like we saw 7 diopters. This is around 3 to 4 diopters, and this is no change. And if we see the post-operative polarization sensitive OCT, just with the cross-linking effect, the patient which has good collagen has actually become better, and that is why the flattening is more. And the patient with a decent amount of collagen has flattened relatively well, and patient which had hardly any collagen has not actually flattened a lot, and that's why that is depending on the level of collagen. So with this slide, I just want to show that your cross-linking outcomes actually depends on the amount, the orientation, and the arrangement of the collagen you have in your cornea. And it is not dependent on what protocol, it is not exactly or completely dependent on what protocol you use or how much energy you give to the patient. It depends on the amount of collagen fibers collagen orientation and the amount of collagen you have in the cornea. So sir, you would like to add anything here or in this thing?
I think this is your last slide, right? So what happens is, this is a very important slide, and this follows the classic rule of seeing the unseen. When you see something like this for the first time, you realize all that confusing issues we used to have once upon a time about why sometimes cornea gets so flattened so much. And this is one of the major issues of patient dissatisfaction. They say, I got a cross-linking done, but my scarring is there, but somebody else did a cross-linking on somebody else. There was no scarring. Let's look at this image for a minute. The last image, you need to have a weaker collagen to create cross-linking. There are times when many topographies, with no offense to anybody, have been, the reading of the topographies has been completely wrong. People have cross-linked on something which looks like a keratoconus, but not a keratoconus. Imagine the pre-op. I don't have the pre-op of some of these patients in this slide, but if the pre-op of this patient looked like keratoconus, it could be my fault also, or because the topography is showing that it's keratoconus. But sometimes there are so many other factors which is hidden, like the cornea may be completely normal. The cornea may not have any features of keratoconus. So these cases would end up in having excessive reaction. It's like giving chemotherapy when you don't have cancer. What happens? You give chemotherapy when you don't have cancer, the tissue will just burn. You'll have fibrosis. This is exactly what happens in the first thing. You can see the amount of fibrotic thing. You have a tissue which is weaker, you infuse them with cross-linking, the tissue will become stronger. When you have absolutely no collagen, then it's nothing to cross-link, then they'll be completely different. This is an amazing concept about the times whenever you see an excessive flattening. Think about, go back and check whether you operated on a early keratoconus, which probably, I think, could have aborted itself from progression. So it's a very important concept, which I want to dry out in this particular slide, is be careful of at least giving a 6 months wait time for every keratoconus you see, so that you will know if it's progressing, then there's something in the middle. If Pooja can put a cursor, that middle one is the one which would be an ideal cross-linker, good demarcation line, good flattening, and it will give you the best results because you have waited, you know it's a true keratoconus, it's progressing. The one in the first, which has an excessive flattening, probably might have aborted itself, and it might not have actually progressed. So this is a very important point which I want to bring up in this particular presentation. How many more minutes I have? Are we done with that time, or we have few more minutes?
I think we have 2 more minutes, sir.
Yeah,
Chaitra,
we have exactly 5 minutes. So
perfect. Chaitra, I'll ask each one of you for a minute. Tell me one mistake you did in your career which has made you smarter. Just one mistake. Not on the personal front, just on the professional front.
No, so I think one major thing that I used to not do before, which I have now started definitely doing, is to tell the patient that this is not the full and final solution. That can very much happen with cataract, but not with retina. So they're so used to retinal, cataract surgeries happening within 10, 15 minutes, and then for the rest of their lives, they don't really need to bother. It doesn't happen like that with retina, because retina diseases are a manifestation of the systemic issues. So my one line to them is, when you find a cure for your diabetes and you don't need treatment anymore, that is when you'll have a cure for all your retinal diseases.
Perfect. I'll come back to you if I have more time. Keep the second one ready. Lucy? Are you here?
Yes, sir. I would say, as we were talking about the optics and each element of the eye, it is going into details of each element. Like we have had cases where we have just ignored the epithelium. So now those cases where there are systemic problems or they are on chronic treatment, we need to consider epithelium also separately for our cataract or any other procedure. So that is something we learned recently and would like to apply it further.
Perfect. So the impact of epithelium and epithelial mapping, if you can apply it, if you have the access to technology in your practice. If you don't have access, at least adopt OCT, as Chaitra said, and the topography, whatever topographer you have. Gairik?
I think what I have learned the mistakes is not to generalize, everything to all patients. Like I spoke about PRK Hayes stratifying, each patient is separate. How each patient behaves even to the same procedure is different. So looking at each patient, spending more time pre-operatively so that we can improve post-operative outcomes. That is something I think I have learned, and not just rush into a procedure and then do damage control post-operatively. That's what I have learned.
Perfect. Palak?
So I would say my lessons would be composite of actually all the 3 things which these people have mentioned. A thorough pre-op evaluation, as we recently discussed in this case also, becomes very important, so that later on going and undoing things which we have not seen clearly or carefully pre-operatively. And secondly, never generalize or over-promise anyone. Like this PRK patient I mentioned, for them and for me, it was like just one eye needs to be operated and it is just a week's job, and then she can go back to US and relax. But that is not how it turned out to be.
And that was a good learning case for everybody. We had so many factors in it. Dry eye, anisometropia, drugs, personality, multiple things in it. I think it's a very good case. That's one of the good cases to take home from this session. Sharon, you have 20 seconds.
So very quickly, 2 things. Even though I see so many dry eye, and we were discussing the other day, recently I saw a patient whom I myself have seen, I think 2 or 3 times. And she always used to complain saying, Urita in Kannada, saying it's burning, it's burning, it's burning. And she used to come with her daughter-in-law, and they obviously had some issues. So I was attributing her complaints to that. but and everything used to come normal. But when we did the confocal, she actually had a microneuroma and a problem. So
Thank you all. A wonderful session, lots of discussion. I don't want to take anybody's time more. Let's see you next year in a physical format. Thank you, and thank you the backup team.
you, sir.
You did a great
Thank
job.
you, doctor. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you so much.